1961, Los Angeles, California. The most famous woman in the world checked herself into a psychiatric facility and asked for help. She was 34 years old. She had survived foster care and poverty and the studio system and 2 broken marriages and the slow grinding erosion of being seen as something other than what she was for the entirety of her adult life. She had made films that would outlast everyone who had doubted her. She had fought Fox to a standstill and won. She had studied at the Actors Studio and been called the most gifted student Lee Strasberg had ever taught. She had delivered performances that Billy Wilder and Laurence Olivier, both of whom had treated her with varying degrees of condescension on set, had been forced in their honest moments to call extraordinary. She had done all of that, and she was not well. She had not been well for a long time. The anxiety that had been present since childhood, the specific bone-deep anxiety of someone who learned very young that safety was temporary and love was conditional, and the people you depended on had a consistent tendency to disappear, had been deepening for years into something that the sleeping pills and the pain medication and the various prescriptions that various doctors had provided were no longer capable of managing. She knew she needed help. That is the most important thing to understand about what happened in 1961. She was not passive. She was not simply overwhelmed and unable to function. She looked at her own situation with the same clear, honest intelligence she brought to everything, assessed it accurately, and asked for help with a directness that took courage she had in abundance even now, even here, even at the lowest point of her life. The help that arrived was partial. It was insufficient. It came too late and in the wrong forms and from people who, with some exceptions, were more interested in managing Marilyn Monroe the asset than in caring for Norma Jean the person. But she asked. Right up until the end, she kept asking. This is episode 5. The pills, the lateness, the firings, the hospitalization, the people who had the power to help and chose not to. And the woman underneath all of it, still reading, still writing, still reaching, who deserved so much more than what the world gave her in her final years. The medication had begun innocuously enough, the way these things almost always begin, with a legitimate need and a doctor willing to meet it. Marilyn Monroe had suffered from insomnia for most of her adult life. The anxiety that was the permanent background noise of her existence made sleep elusive in the specific way that anxiety makes sleep elusive. The mind too active, too vigilant, unable to release its grip on the catalog of things that could go wrong, even in the hours when the body desperately needed rest. Sleeping pills were the solution her doctors offered. They worked. She took them. She also suffered from the chronic pain of endometriosis, a condition that had been causing her significant physical suffering since her early 20s, and that her doctors managed in the medical culture of the 1950s, primarily through pain medication rather than through any of the more sophisticated interventions that would become available in later decades. The pain medication worked. She took that too. What no one adequately monitored, not the doctors who prescribed, not the studio that was aware of her medication use and chose to view it as a management problem rather than a health crisis, not the people around her who saw the signs and looked away because looking directly at them was inconvenient, was the interaction between the various medications, the escalating doses required to produce the same effect as tolerance built, and the specific danger of combining sedatives with the alcohol she used to take the edge off the anxiety on the days when the pills alone were not sufficient. By the late 1950s, what had begun as legitimate medical treatment had become dependency. She was not taking the pills because she wanted to be high or because she was careless with her health. She was taking them because her body had adapted to them and because the alternative, the full force of the anxiety and the insomnia and the pain without chemical management, was something she no longer had the resources to endure unassisted. The people who had the power to intervene, doctors, studio executives, the people who managed her career and her public image, made a collective and largely unspoken decision to manage the situation rather than address it. Marilyn Monroe on medication was difficult. Marilyn Monroe off medication and in full crisis was worse. For schedules, for productions, for the carefully managed public image that remained extraordinarily commercially valuable, even as the person inside it was deteriorating. She needed a doctor who would treat her as a patient rather than as an asset to be maintained. She did not consistently have one. What made the situation particularly dangerous was the number of doctors involved. Marilyn Monroe was not seeing one physician who had a complete picture of her health and her medication use. She was seeing several: a psychiatrist, an internist, a specialist for the endometriosis, occasional consultants brought in by the studio, and none of them had full visibility into what the others were prescribing. In the medical culture of the late 1950s, this was not considered unusual. Patient confidentiality and the absence of coordinated care meant that each doctor managed his own piece of the picture without anyone being responsible for the whole. The whole was becoming dangerous. The combination of barbiturates for sleep, pain medication for the endometriosis, and the alcohol she used to bridge the gap between doses was a physiological situation that any physician with full information would have recognized as requiring immediate intervention. No physician had full information. The system that was supposed to protect her had too many gaps, and she fell through all of them simultaneously, quietly, over years, in a way that was invisible until it was almost too late. The lateness became the public story. It was easier than the real one. From the late 1950s onward, Marilyn Monroe's chronic inability to arrive on set at the scheduled time became one of the most discussed and most criticized aspects of her professional life. Directors complained. Co-stars complained. Studio executives complained. The press reported on it with a mixture of exasperation and barely disguised contempt, treating it as evidence of the selfishness and unreliability that they had, many of them, always suspected was underneath the glamour. What the complaints and the coverage almost universally omitted was the reason. She was not late because she was careless or arrogant or indifferent to the schedules of the people around her. She was late because the anxiety attacks that preceded her appearances on set, particularly on productions where the work genuinely mattered to her, where she was attempting something serious and was therefore genuinely vulnerable to failure, were debilitating in a physical sense. They were not nerves in the ordinary professional meaning of the word. They were full physiological events: the racing heart, the inability to breathe properly, the paralysis of a body that was refusing to move towards something it experienced as an existential threat. She wanted to be there. She was trying to get there. The distance between wanting and being able to was not a character flaw. It was a medical condition that was being treated inadequately and discussed publicly as a personality defect. The production suffered. That is true and worth acknowledging. The people whose schedules were disrupted had legitimate frustrations. But the accounting of who was responsible for those disruptions has historically been conducted in a way that placed the entire weight of blame on Marilyn Monroe, and none of it on the industry that had been medicating her inadequately for a decade, on the set conditions that were frequently hostile to the kind of careful, interior work she needed to do her best, or on a professional culture that had never built any structure for supporting the mental health of the performers it depended on. Billy Wilder's complaints about Some Like It Hot became famous. The 47 takes of a scene in which she had to open a drawer and retrieve a bottle of bourbon became a kind of shorthand for her difficulty and unreliability. What became less famous was Wilder's private acknowledgement made years after the film that every single one of those takes had been different, and that what ended up in the film was the take that was right, that she had found something in the 47th attempt that the first 46 had been searching for. The takes were worth it. She knew they were worth it. She was the only one who never stopped knowing. What was also omitted from the public accounting was the specific cruelty of the set conditions on Some Like It Hot. The film was shot in the summer, partly in Florida, in heat that was physically taxing for everyone. Marilyn was pregnant during part of the production, a pregnancy that would end in another miscarriage, another private loss absorbed in public silence while the cameras kept rolling and the schedule kept demanding and the director kept complaining to anyone who would listen about how difficult she was. She was not difficult. She was a woman who was losing a pregnancy and working anyway and arriving late because she was in physical and emotional crisis and had no framework around her adequate to hold any of it. She delivered the greatest comic performance of the decade under those conditions. The people around her knew it and said so to each other privately. The public story remained the 47 takes and the director's exasperation and the image of Marilyn Monroe as her own worst enemy, an image that was convenient for everyone except her. In January 1961, shortly after the release of The Misfits and the finalization of her divorce from Arthur Miller, Marilyn Monroe voluntarily admitted herself to the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York City. She had asked her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, for help finding a place where she could rest and recover. Somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the demands and the cameras and the relentless machinery of her public life, where she could receive proper treatment for the anxiety and the dependency that had been building for years without adequate intervention. What she found at Payne Whitney was not rest. She was placed on her admission in a locked ward. Her room had no windows that opened. Her belongings were taken from her. She was observed continuously. The environment, institutional, restrictive, offering none of the dignity or autonomy that her psychiatrist had led her to expect, produced in her not calm, but terror. The terror of someone who had spent her childhood in institutions that controlled her life and moved her between homes without her consent, who had fought her entire adult life to build autonomy and self-determination, and who found herself now, at 34 years old, back inside a locked room with no control over when the door would open. She called Joe DiMaggio. He flew to New York immediately. He told the clinic to release her. They released her. He checked her into a different facility, the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, where she received the care that Payne Whitney had failed to provide. She was there for 3 weeks. When she left, she said that DiMaggio had saved her life. She meant it literally, the relationship between them. Divorced, not romantic in any conventional sense, permanently complicated by the history of their marriage, had evolved into something that did not fit the normal categories. He was not her husband. He was not quite her friend. He was the person who came when she called, who did not ask questions, who did not need her to be Marilyn when he arrived. He just came. Every time for the rest of her life. In April 1962, Marilyn Monroe began filming Something's Got to Give at 20th Century Fox. It would be her first film in over a year. The production was troubled from the beginning. She was ill with a persistent sinus infection that made filming genuinely difficult. She was still in the fragile recovery that had followed the hospitalization, and the relationship between her and the studio had deteriorated over years of conflict into something that was less a working partnership than a managed hostility. She missed days. She arrived late on the days she came. Fox, which had committed to a production schedule and a budget and which was simultaneously dealing with the catastrophic cost overruns of Cleopatra filming in Rome, was running out of patience and running out of money and looking, with increasing urgency, for somewhere to direct the blame. In May 1962, she left the production temporarily to fulfill a commitment she had made months earlier, to appear at Madison Square Garden for President Kennedy's birthday celebration. She had been asked to perform. She had agreed. Fox had agreed to the absence when it was negotiated. They withdrew their agreement when the production fell further behind schedule and chose, when she returned, to treat her fulfillment of a prior commitment as an act of professional betrayal. On June 8, 1962, 20th Century Fox fired Marilyn Monroe from Something's Got to Give. The announcement was made publicly, with the specific deliberateness of an institution that wanted the industry to understand what it was doing and why. She was in breach of contract. She was unreliable. She was, the studio communicated through its official statements and its unofficial channels simultaneously, more trouble than she was worth. The irony, the specific, bitter irony that everyone who knew the facts understood and no one in the official story had any incentive to emphasize, was that the footage Fox had shot before firing her was extraordinary. The cinematographer, the crew, the director, all of them said so privately. The rushes showed a Marilyn Monroe who was, despite everything, Despite the illness and the anxiety and the medication and the personal devastation of the previous 2 years doing something extraordinary on screen, Fox destroyed the footage, most of it. The little that survived confirmed what the crew had said. She was doing the best work of her career in the months before her death. The studio that fired her knew it. They fired her anyway. 2 weeks after Fox fired her, Marilyn Monroe returned to the studio for a photo shoot, not for the film she had been fired from, for herself. The photographer was Lawrence Schiller, and the session, which included the now famous photographs of her swimming nude in the unfinished pool scene from Something's Got to Give, produced some of the most extraordinary images ever taken of her. She was 36 years old. She had just been publicly humiliated by the most powerful studio in Hollywood. She was unwell in ways that the people closest to her understood, and that she herself understood with complete clarity. She had 2 months left to live. The photographs show none of that. What they show is Marilyn Monroe entirely in her element, in front of a camera, on a set, in the one space in the world where the anxiety receded, and what remained was simply the extraordinary, undiminished, completely natural rapport between this specific woman and a lens. She is radiant in the photographs. She is free in them, in the specific way that she was always free when the camera was running, laughing, unguarded, more alive-looking than in anything that had been captured of her in years. She knew what she was doing. She told the photographer in their conversations between setups that she wanted the images to be the best of her career, that she wanted Fox, which had just told the world she was finished, to see what finished looked like. She was not finished. The photographs were the evidence. She also gave, in the weeks following the photo shoot, a series of interviews that have been described by everyone who has read them as among the most lucid and self-aware conversations she ever had on record. She spoke about her work with genuine intelligence and genuine passion. She spoke about her future, the projects she wanted to do, the roles she was interested in, the continued evolution of a career she intended to have for decades more. She spoke about herself with the combination of honesty and humor that had always been, for the people who knew her, one of her most distinctive and most appealing qualities. She said in one of these interviews that she intended to be a lot of trouble for a lot more years. She meant it. Right up until the end, she meant it. The last 3 years of Marilyn Monroe's life are not the story of a star self-destructing. They are the story of a profoundly ill woman fighting with the tools available to her and the support she was given, which was never enough, to stay upright, to keep working, to keep being someone, to insist against accumulating institutional indifference that Norma Jean was still there and still worth caring for. She lost ground. Every year, she lost more ground. The pills took more. The anxiety took more. The professional humiliations took more. The loneliness, always present, never fully addressed, the fundamental wound of a life that had begun with abandonment and had never found the relationship that could adequately answer it, took the most. And yet she kept reading. She kept writing in her journals. She kept showing up to sets and photo shoots and interviews and being in those moments completely and unmistakably herself. Funny, honest, brilliant, reaching, the most alive person in any room she entered. She had 1 summer left, 1 more photo shoot, 1 more set of interviews in which she talked about the future with genuine conviction. 1 more chance to be seen clearly, finally, by the world that had spent 36 years seeing mostly the surface. Episode 6, August 4th, 1962, The Last Day. The unanswered questions and why Norma Jean Mortensen, the girl from the foster homes, the woman behind the image, the most famous face in the world, has never stopped being mourned by the people who understood what was actually lost. This is Legends of America.